How do you respond to stress? Do you get so stressed out that you can't function anymore, can't sleep, can't concentrate, can't do anything? Maybe you get so fixated on the stressor that you go over and over in your head what you could have done or what you will do. Now, if you've responded yes to any of these scenarios, then it's highly likely that you have experienced a stressful event. Now, for the majority of the population, these are normal responses to stresses. However, what's interesting about stress is that when it comes to our stress response, there is a whole subsection of the population that don't suffer from stress in the same way as the rest of the population. A perfect example to make my point is the American astronaut and aeronautical engineer Neil Armstrong, who was famous for being the first person to walk on the moon, but also famous for being calm under extreme pressure and stressful events that could leave most people frozen in fear and paralysed by the stressor. Now, a well-known example is the Apollo 11 mission, including the moon landing, involving a near catastrophic situation where the lunar module, Eagle, was dangerously low on fuel during the descent. Now, according to NASA, the Eagle's fuel gauge indicated only 25 seconds of fuel remaining just before landing, and the mission was close to being aborted. However, Neil Armstrong skillfully navigated the Eagle, avoiding hazardous terrain and landing safely with a small margin of fuel. Now, this calmness under pressure and stressful events are nicely depicted in the movie titled First Man, where Ryan Gosling plays Neil Armstrong. Understandably, most people want to know how they can become more like Neil Armstrong. And yet, for the rest of us, it doesn't matter what we do, we still suffer from stress in the same ways that are harmful to our health and well-being. This is what makes the science of stress so fascinating, because it's an inevitable part of life that cannot be avoided. And at the same time, we all respond very differently to stresses in life. Welcome to Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz, where academic rigour meets real life. I'm Dr. Stephen Stolz, educator, philosopher and academic at the University of Adelaide, and this podcast series is my quest to help everyday people access research-based ideas that feed curiosity and foster deep thinking. In today's episode, I explore the topic of stress and examine the adverse effects of stress on the mind and the body and consider some really thought-provoking discoveries before I turn my attention to some stress management approaches that are worth considering. Whether you suffer from chronic stress or you're just interested in learning more about the science of stress, then this episode will provide you with both the intellectual framework and practical insights to navigate this important area of life. By the end of our time together, you'll understand the adverse effects of stress on the mind and the body and discover some useful ways to cope with stress. So join me as I bridge the gap between evidence-based research and everyday application. This is Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz. Now, I want to start out with a thought experiment based on a very well-known analogy, and I'd be surprised if a lot of you didn't know about this analogy. But when you see a glass of water, and in that glass, what do you see? Do you see the glass half empty or half full? Now, I'm using this example and thought experiment because how we perceive and interpret things count when it comes to stress. However, it's important to point out that there is more to stress than how we perceive and interpret something. So when it comes to stress, there is a significant variation in how humans respond to certain stresses. Now, take, for instance, the following example involving Turbo and Axel the animal from the pub. Now, for most people, waiting in a long queue at the supermarket, now this wouldn't even register as something stressful for most people. But to Axel the animal, it stresses him right out, big time. And yet when it comes to parachuting, which he does on weekends for fun, he is completely calm and zen-like. Indeed, he's always talking about extreme sports or his next risky adventure. And it's quite clear to everyone that he's addicted to adrenaline. Now, most people at the pub think he's just showing off and big talking. And yet, in each adventure, he has to up the stakes to make it riskier. I think this is how he got his nickname, Axel the animal, because he's like an animal who has been conditioned to love adrenaline and thrill-seeking, and he simply can't stop, even if he wanted to. I think it's a great nickname for him, to be honest. Now, anyway, back to my scenario, but this time related to Turbo. Well, when it comes to Turbo, I don't need to ask him if he gets stressed waiting in a long queue at the supermarket because I already know it would barely register as stressful. But if it came to parachuting, which he has never done, then I know his stress levels would be off the charts. What is interesting about this example is the way in which Axel gets stressed waiting in a long queue and at the same time registers no stress when parachuting. I mean, this seems like an abnormal stress response because most people would be like Turbo, barely registering any stress while waiting in the queue, and extreme stress if they had to parachute for the first time. Now, it's worth pausing for a moment to ask what is going on here when it comes to our stress response, because these are cases of conditioning and adaptation, particularly in relation to Axel. So in a sense, there is good and bad news when it comes to this example. The good news being that we condition our stress responses to cope and overcome stress. Conversely, the bad news is that we also condition our stress responses to avoid or ignore the source of stress, which can actually prolong the stress and actually make it worse in the long run. Now, whether we like it or not, when it comes to stress, it's an unavoidable part of life. Now, take, for instance, some of the most stressful things a human can experience, such as the death of a loved one, like maybe like a spouse, partner, or even a child. And then we have divorce, and then we can think of job loss. And these are generally always consistently ranked amongst the most stressful life events a person can endure. Now, I would have to agree with this list of stresses because when it comes to stress, my mind automatically goes to the various university restructures I've been through from around 2016 onwards. And that led to my eventual redundancy in 2019 from the university I worked at the time. Now, during this period, I distinctly remember my hands shaking uncontrollably, my heart racing at 100 miles an hour. I hadn't eaten anything. I hadn't slept for days. And I was just suffering from really unexplained headaches, migraines. And I would just sweat profusely for no apparent reason, particularly on cold days, which, of course, is always concerning. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, I remember the day I actually lost my job, and I remember it like it was yesterday because I actually thought I was having a heart attack, and it really freaked me out because I had no idea what was going on. And so my wife got angry at me and said, "You have to go to your GP now." And when I saw my GP, look, he made it quite clear to me that I actually wasn't suffering from a heart attack. That was the good news, but I was just experiencing symptoms of acute episodic stress and also chronic stress, which I found surprising at the time. Now, the fact that I didn't have a heart attack, I did take that as good news. But little did I know that stress, particularly chronic stress, which was the bit that really surprised me, that would change my life forever. Now, when it comes to stress, I immediately think of Edvard Munch's The Scream, which is a famous artistic depiction of stress, particularly existential anxiety and a feeling of being overwhelmed. Now, if you're just unfamiliar with this piece of work, I would encourage you just to go to any search engine and just type in The Scream, and then the image will come up in the painting. And in the meantime, if you don't have access to a search engine, then I'll just give you a brief description. Now, The Scream depicts an androgynous figure with a contorted face, mouth wide open, as if screaming, standing on a bridge with hands covering their ears. The background is a swirling vortex of colour, including a blood-red sky representing chaos and an unsettling environment. Now, the figure's expression and the surrounding landscape are interpreted as conveying intense anxiety and a feeling of a stream of echoing through nature. Now, I seriously love this painting for a range of reasons. But in this case, I think it aptly captures aspects of stress and just a general sense of feeling overwhelmed by the weight of the world. Now, The Scream is deeply confronting. So I need to warn you, when you do look at this painting, it can be quite confronting because of the distorted figure, the vibrant colours, the unsettling background. And there's just this level of intensity that's just really unsettling. So I challenge you to look at it intently and feel that intensity and lean into it just to get a general sense of what I'm talking about here. And there's something about it. I just want to look away, but I can't. I'm just kind of transfixed by this painting. Now, I think Munch captures something very universal about the human condition, and that's just really difficult to ignore. And this is quite simple, really, and that from time to time, we just want to scream. And I know myself, sometimes you just want to scream. There are other artists who have depicted stress, and they are worth noting now. And there's some other works that I want to make reference to, and that's one is Frida Kahlo and Francis Bacon. Now, there's also beyond art, there's popular depiction of stress that can also be found in literature, film, and music. And in film, I just automatically think of Sylvester Stallone's portrayal of Rambo in First Blood. I reckon that's a really iconic representation of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, of a Vietnam veteran who's just trying to assimilate back into society. Then there's also Linda Hamilton's portrayal of Sarah Connor in Terminator 2. And there are a whole range of other movies that you can go to, but I just automatically think of these two because there are obvious representations. And I should just point, just on a side note, I will be doing an episode on PTSD in future episodes. So do make sure you tune in to that episode, particularly if you're interested in PTSD. All right, back to stress. Now, today I see stress everywhere. Even Turbo and Sludge from the pub get stressed. Now, Turbo gets stressed when he's delayed delivering a load in his truck, stuck in traffic going nowhere fast, and dickhead drivers. Now, in fact, his number one pen hate that stresses him right out are dickhead drivers who pull in front of his truck and brake suddenly when he has a full load. As for Sludge, he gets stressed out when he is concreting on a hot day and the concrete is drying fast and the truck is delayed with the next load. Now, I guess you could say that their drinking at the pub is the way they cope. But I know from listening to them, they go on and on and on about these things. So I'm pretty confident I've given an accurate representation of some of the things that stress them out, particularly turbo and dickhead drivers. Now, another useful example that I commonly see most weekends is my daughter's netball coach. Now, I call her Sheila the stress head. And I'll explain why. Now, my daughter is in the local sub-primary netball competition on the weekend, which means many of the players are just learning. They're the beginners. And on weekends, when Sheila is coaching, it's quite obvious she is stress off her head, trying to control everything, which of course she can't. And hence the nickname, Sheila the stress head. But I often wonder if Sheila, the stress head's personality, is negatively contributing to her stress because she just wants to control everything. And she's obviously competitive, ambitious, and so on. So I think there's plenty to reflect on here with Sheila, the stress head, and what is known about people with type A personality traits. For instance, people with type A personality traits are known for their excessive competitive drive, aggression, and they're just always in a rush. And there are other things that obviously are clear to me. For instance, there's this very strong drive for achievement. And interesting enough, type A personality type people suffer from stress and burnout more than others, as well as other health-related conditions. Now, whether Sheila has type A personality type is probably irrelevant here because myself as an interested observer around this stress makes me stressed with her constant yelling and barking of instructions from the sideline. And it gets so bad, I have to actually leave the court and I have to relocate to another spot just so I don't get a headache from all the yelling and barking of instructions. And I would hate to think what it would be like for some of these players on both sides actually to have to hear that. Of course, as I'm an interested observer and as a father, but I clearly can see there is a level of stress at play here. By now, you are probably wondering why the episode on stress. Now, I need to point out from the get-go that my understanding of stress has changed forever. Now, let me try and briefly explain. Like most people, I just initially accepted stress as a necessary part of life in the modern world. And I actually never gave it a second thought at all to the adverse effects stress was having on my mind and body, until it actually started to have a negative impact on my health and well-being. Stress is like a thief in the night because it often arrives or occurs suddenly and unexpectedly. And this is why we should take stress seriously, particularly if it's chronic in nature. So when it comes to understanding stress, I think it's actually quite useful to start with the Yerkes-Dodson law. Now, most people are broadly familiar with the Yerkes-Dodson law, which is often referred to as the inverted U theory because it's used a lot in sport. Now, basically, the empirical theory explains the relationship between arousal and performance for optimal performance. And you can see why it's used a lot in sport. For instance, performance increases with physiological or mental arousal, but only up to a point. And when levels of arousal are too low or too high, performance decreases. Now, depending on the task, different levels of arousal are required for optimal performance. And the process often is illustrated graphically as an inverted U, and hence the title that most people are used to or familiar with in relation to this law. And that's why it's referred to as the inverted U theory. Now, most people intuitively understand this theory, and it does make sense. And this is why I'm using it now. Now, I'm going to stay with this theoretical model to frame my point. Now, the upward part of the inverted U can be thought of as the energizing or stimulating effect of arousal. And this can be viewed as the good stress, which is what I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then the downward part is caused by the negative effects of arousal caused by stress, and that can be viewed as bad stress because it negatively impairs performance. Now, a point of clarification. When it comes to stress, usually it is interpreted negatively. However, it's important to point out that some stress may actually have some positive effects, what they call eustress, and they are generally episodic or transient in nature. Now, some commonly encountered positive responses to stresses could be just any of the following, and these are some examples. For instance, you have a job interview, and of course you need to prepare, but that stress, if you like, prepares you for that job interview. And of course, it's episodic, it's transient, it passes after the job interview. It could be another example, which is a quite common one, is maybe the first day in a new job, or a first date, or getting married. I know when I got married, I was very anxious and nervous, and some would say that's a positive stress. Leaving home for the first time, if you fly in the coop and it's the first time you've moved out of home, naturally, you're going to be slightly stressed about that transition period. And I've just got another one listed here around pregnancy and childbirth. Of course, if you are giving birth, I can only just imagine how stressful that could be. I know I've been present for many births for my children, and I know it can be both a very enjoyable experience, but also quite stressful one. But inevitably, it does pass. It's episodic, transient. And by the way, I should point out, I would say it's overwhelmingly a positive experience. So I don't want to emphasize the stressful aspect, because it definitely is a very, very positive experience, at least from my own point of view. Basically, how you interpret and respond to a stressor is a contributing factor. And this is why different people may interpret the same stressor differently. For example, a difficult math problem or a difficult maths test on a take-home final exam may cause positive stress or eustress for a very good student of mathematics. But at the same time, it could also cause distress for another student not so good at mathematics. And that's just a common example. Generally, when it comes to stress, for most people, it either passes or lingers. And that's the important thing to note here if you're listening to this. So the good news that for the majority of the population, stress is acute and or episodic, and it passes over time. Now, for the bad news, if it lingers and becomes chronic stress, then the long-term effects of that stress can actually make you ill or sick. This is the point Robert Sapolsky makes in his excellent book titled Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and details of that book can be found in the episode descriptor. Now, due to evolutionary reasons, all humans possess fight or flight responses that are automatic. But I'm going to add something here which we tend to forget. It can be fight or flight or freeze. And we tend to forget about the freeze here in relation to this theory. Now, these are automatic physiological reactions to perceived threats, and they prepare our body to either confront the threat, fight, or escape it or flight. And of course, in this case, you can freeze. You do nothing. You are frozen in time almost. In fact, there are times we actually need these automatic responses in order to survive certain physical challenges. However, this is where it gets problematic. If you repeatedly turn on the stress response, or if you can't turn it off at all, then these stressful events and the stress response can actually become damaging to your health and well-being, particularly over long periods of time. And that's why I made a point about chronic stress having a negative impact on our health and well-being. Now, a large percentage of what we think of when we talk about stress-related diseases are disorders of excessive stress responses. Now, it's important to point out here, so there's no misunderstanding, that chronic or repeated stresses can actually potentially increase your risk of becoming or being sick. Now, stresses, even if massive, repetitive, or even just chronic in nature, they don't automatically lead to illness or sickness. This is really important I mention that here. Okay, so there's no kind of causal relationship here. Now, back to the book about Sapolsky and why zebras don't get ulcers. Well, unlike zebras, whose stress response only activate in real danger, when it comes to humans, we could trigger the same life or death or even freeze response just by thinking about a threat or even a what-if scenario, or just maybe just sitting in traffic, or just worrying if I've got enough money to pay for lunch, or just maybe a tense interaction you might have had with a spouse or a work colleague at work. And just on a side note, this is actually one of the main reasons why zebras don't get ulcers and why humans do. Psychological stress is stressful to humans because chronic stress keeps you stuck because your brain sees everything as a threat. And a useful book that makes this point well is Bessel van der Kolk's book titled The Body Keeps the Score. And he makes this point very well, that stress, it's in your mind and your body. Notice that I'm emphasizing and your body. And this is why I wanted to do this episode on stress, because it's really a contributing factor for a wide range of conditions. And as you would have heard before about an early episode about burnout, and of course, I've got an episode coming up on PTSD, so make sure you tune into that. It disrupts sleep, which we've seen from Dr. Mark Kohler in early episodes. And there are a whole range of other kind of mood-altering effects in terms of it just makes you generally unhappy. And so most people quite rightly care about stress because of the negative impact it has on their health and well-being. And one thing I want to just quickly note here about van der Kolk's book about Body Keeps the Score is that what's interesting about chronic stress is that you can't turn it off. It's just like you're stuck. And that physiological symptom is known as hypervigilance. You are stuck. You can't wind down. You can't relax. You can't sleep. You are just on all the time. Everything is a threat. You might hear a sound and it might trigger and you might react, and then automatically it reacts your physiological responses and the adrenaline. And so you can understand how over long term, if you can't relax and your central nervous system is turned up to 150, you can see how that's going to be a problem over long term. So this turns to the question of what are some of the adverse effects of stress on the mind and body? That's an inevitable question. So let's have a look at this now. In order to understand stress, I think it's important that we look at some of the science and look at some of the foundational aspects which are really crucial if we're going to intervene and protect ourselves against stress. Okay, so what are some of the physiological responses to stress? And I'd already alluded to some of this, but let's do a deep dive on this and have a look at it. Now, let's start with the key concept of homeostasis. Now, this is a really important concept. Now, homeostasis is the tendency of an organism to maintain physiological equilibrium in the body so that blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen, so on and so forth, actually maintained at normal physiological ranges. Now, stress disrupts this physiological equilibrium through activation of a specific part of the nervous system, which then, through chemical messengers, activates adrenal glands to secrete various stress hormones, including cortisol. Now, In general, the nervous system can be broadly divided into the central nervous system. And the central nervous system consists of the brains, optic nerves, and spinal cord. And you would have heard me before talk about the central nervous system being turned up to 150. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, and then that includes nerves, the ganglia outside of the brain, and spinal cord. And these are just the nerves that go to and from the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system can be subdivided into voluntary nervous system, that's the somatic nervous system, and then the involuntary nervous system, that's the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system, it's really vital here for maintaining homeostasis because this nervous system controls vital functions of the body, including heart rate, blood pressure, so on and so forth. Now, the autonomic nervous system has two subdivisions, and that's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, stress activates the sympathetic nervous system and prepares the body for a stress response. It gets our body to either fight, flight, or freeze, while the parasympathetic nervous system calms the body and attempts to restore homeostasis during stress response. That's the bit that can't return to homeostasis. That's the bit where I was talking about, with PTSD and chronic stress. We can't return to homeostasis. We're just on 24/7, turned up to 150. Central nervous system, it's just turned up to 150. And we can't turn down that central nervous system volume. And this is why chronic stress is such a big deal. This is why PTSD and so on are significantly adverse people's health and well-being. Now, in response to a perceived threat, this is the fight or flight or even freeze response that I was talking about earlier. Now, sensory nerves, eyes, ears, so on, they send information to the amygdala. And this is where the fear is registered in the brain for processing. Now, if the amygdala interprets this information as perceived danger, then it instantly sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus, which is the primary stress response center in the brain. Within seconds of perceiving danger, our bodies secrete various hormones as a stress response, like epinephrine and norepinephrine. Another important class of hormones in the response to stress are called glucocorticoids or cortisol, which is a major stress hormone responsible for the stress response. This is why cortisol is a biomarker of stress, particularly people experiencing chronic stress. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in the science here, but basically the former acts within seconds, and that's the epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then the latter, that's glucocorticoids or cortisol, backs up this activity over the course of minutes or hours. Ideally, when the stressful situation no longer exists, the body attempts to reestablish its original equilibrium. That's the homeostasis that I was talking about before. That's a crucial concept here when it comes to stress. However, if people experiencing chronic stress, the original homeostasis very rarely gets reestablished. And as I said before, over long periods of time, this has a negative impact on our health and well-being. And this is why we report certain symptoms and we become familiar and aware of these physical symptoms first. And then sometimes when we're aware of these physical symptoms, sometimes it's too late. However, it's important to be mindful of these physical symptoms. So let's have a look at how stress, particularly acute stress, episodic acute stress, and chronic stress plays out as physical symptoms. So when it comes to the science of stress, there are a few things to note. Now, acute stresses usually have a short duration. Now, we're just talking minutes or hours here. But chronic stress, like I've said already, may last for several hours per day, for weeks, or even months, and let's just face it, sometimes years. Now, acute stress is the most common form of stress, and sometimes of acute stress, and that's the eustress that I spoke to you before about the positive type, can actually be quite exciting and actually have really positive effects and really important actually for performance, as well as achieving certain desired goals in life. Now, most people recognise the symptoms of acute stress. That's because acute stress has a short duration and we all experience it from time to time. And the damage it does is actually quite minimal and it's not really something to really be concerned about too much. However, when an individual experiences acute stress frequently, now that's defined as episodic acute stress. As for chronic stress, this occurs when a person does not see any way out of a miserable life situation And this is actually why it's so harmful to the body, because it chronically elevates cortisol levels significantly and increases what they call oxidative stress, which is actually really bad for you. Now, many stresses have lifelong adverse effects on both physical and mental health. And there are a whole range of situations that actually can be a contributing factor here. And some of these are well known. I've already mentioned a few, but a main factor here is poverty. It could be a dysfunctional family. It could be trapped in an unhappy marriage where the thoughts about the possibility of divorce can induce more stress. It could just be an unhappy job situation. It could be prolonged unemployment. It could be just caring for a disabled spouse. And it could just, let's face it, chronic health problems can actually all cause chronic stress. Now, we also know that stress is a well-known trigger for depression, anxiety, fear, and a whole range of behavioural disorders. And so the effects of stress are reasonably well known, and you can search for these in your own time. And so I don't want to spend too much talking about some of the symptoms of acute stress, episodic acute stress, and chronic stress, because these are reasonably well known. And I've already mentioned some of these earlier around headaches, pounding heart, dry mouth, depression, difficulty focusing at work, sleep disturbances, and so on and so forth. It's a reasonably long list. Actually, now I want to turn to some really thought-provoking discoveries around stress. And in preparation for this episode, I found some of these actually really thought-provoking. And I want to turn, again, just very briefly to Sapolsky's book. And Sapolsky spent decades studying social primates, like baboons in the wild. And he made some actually really interesting findings that are really relevant to social rank and actually have implications for health and stress-related diseases among animals in general, particularly for humans. Now, what he found was actually shocking in the sense that you don't want to be a low-ranking or subordinate baboon because they suffer disproportionately from high levels of chronic stress, both physically and psychologically. And basically, he used a range of measures to determine the stress levels of the baboons, such as measuring the stress hormone levels of glucocorticoids or cortisol, like I mentioned earlier, in the blood of low-ranking baboons, and then compared it to dominant baboons. And he found that the subordinate male baboons had higher resting levels of glucocorticoids or cortisol levels at a significantly higher level compared to dominant baboons. Now, if this wasn't bad enough, he also discovered a range of other stress-related problems like elevated resting blood pressure, sluggish cardiovascular response to real stresses, a sluggish or delayed recovery to a stressor, and the list actually goes on and on and on. It's actually quite a long list. Now, interestingly, Sapolsky attributed these physical and psychological stresses to a lack of social control, lack of predictability, and due to limited or no outlets for frustration. And that is worth noting because I will return to that later in this episode. Now, according to Sapolsky, social subordination equals being chronically stressed, and an overactive stress response that increases the likelihood of a stress-related diseases. While rank in a hierarchy, social hierarchy, is an important predictor of individual differences in the stress response, the meaning of that rank and the psychological baggage that accompanies it in a particular society is also important. But so is the ability to actively take advantage of the outlets or social support available to them. Now, this brings us to socioeconomic status and poverty. And I did mention poverty is a factor for chronic stress. Now, if you want to see an example of chronic stress, then being poor involves a disproportionate amount of physical and psychological stresses. Now, this is where a lack of control and a lack of predictability is most evident in a population. The next factor, being poor, means that you often can't cope with stresses very efficiently because you just have no resources in reserve. You just have no extra money. For instance, if you need to see a doctor or get medication or food. And also you can't plan for the future because you basically are living in the here and now. It gets worse because poverty brings with it a marked lack of outlets and a serious lack of social support. So what does this all mean? I mean, the link between socioeconomic status, or SES, and health is reasonably clear. There's a lot of research already that covers this ground. But what's interesting about this is that being poor increases the likelihood of poor health outcomes. This isn't a story about an inability to access universal health care or being poorly educated and other protective factors. So here's the catch about stress. Stress is heavily rooted in psychology because when you are no longer dealing with a predator that might be chasing you, for instance, and when you have sufficient shelter and food to sustain good health, and once all these kind of basic needs have been met, then it's not really about being poor, and it's more about feeling poor or feeling poorer than others around you. Now, that's thought-provoking. Now, that's an important point because this is about one's subjective SES. And being poor is not as bad as feeling poor or being made to feel poor, say through income inequality. Now, what's significant about income inequality in a society is that it lowers the social capital. And social capital just refers to, the social resources and the support you can draw from, like family, friends, and so on. And the lower the social capital is associated with poor health outcomes and poor self-reported health. Now, we shouldn't be too surprised by these findings. In fact, I'm not surprised at all. However, at the same time, this is more than poverty and the poor health of the poor. It's about the stresses caused by a society that tolerates and actually enables the stresses to actually flourish in society. Now, as depressing as this may sound, and it is depressing, there is some hope for us when it comes to stress and managing it. Now, Sapolsky has some very interesting things to say about stress and how humans can cope with stress. And so let's turn to some of these now. Now, probably an important starting point worth noting relates to variability. And my early example of Turbo and Axel, the animal, are examples of variability. Now, given the same stresses, humans vary tremendously in how our bodies and psyches cope. For example, consider the studies of people carrying out dangerous and stressful tasks, like parachuting, learning to land an aircraft on carrier in rough seas, deep sea diving, where divers live underwater in confined spaces for weeks, sometimes months, actually. Now, all these studies show the same pattern. Most people have massive stress responses, and there are a subset that are unflustered. It also reinforces my early example that if Turbo had to parachute for the first time, then he would have a massive stress response, just like the majority of the population in the same situation. Now, understandably, most people are interested in the latter group. And so what is going on here? Now, beyond personality and temperaments, for example, I mentioned earlier personality type A, say, versus other personality types, there is a logical explanation for what is going on here. And it is possible to become a member of this group. That's the member of the unflustered group. Now, just like Axel is unflustered when he parachutes on weekends for fun, this can be attributed to conditioning and adaptation. And over time, if you do enough parachuting, we could all become unflustered, even Turbo. Now, this all sounds too simplistic. And it is, because there is more to stress than coping with stress than conditioning and adaptation. So let's explore some of the cases in which individuals have experienced a horrible stressor and the coping styles they have adopted so we can learn from these cases. Now, generally, it's useful to consider how the following can work for or against you when it comes to stress. And just notice that I'm emphasizing working for you or against you. And I mentioned earlier the feelings of control. Now, feelings of control are really important here. If you have a very strong internal locus of control, that's that inner sense of agency where I feel like I'm in control of my actions and follow my life. Now, you compare that with an external locus of control where an external sense of agency is based on luck or fate. Here, you have a meeting point between the two. And clearly, if you're on the other extreme where you feel like all your life, all your decisions are based on luck and fate, clearly that is going to have an impact on your levels of stress. Now, conversely, if you feel like you have great agency and control over your life, that's that internal locus of control, then you feel like you can take control of your life. You feel like you can take back your life and you can manage stress for yourself and you've got things covered. And so you can see how when it comes to control, even that sense of control, that's that subjective quality of feeling in control, how powerful that can be when it comes to managing stress. And we should not underestimate the importance of that subjective quantity and quality of feeling that internal locus of control. Because if all we feel like is that, fate, luck is in control of my life, well, yes, that is going to have a negative impact and it's going to make things very, very stressful for you. The other one is predictability. That's predictability versus unpredictability. Now, if you feel like and you know that you can predict what's going to happen, then you can manage and cope with stress a lot better than when it comes to unpredictable events. And this is why restructures and why mergers and organizations are so stressful, because it involves a lot of unpredictability. I just happen to be going through a merger right now, and there are a lot of people at my workplace who are super, super, super stressed. And they are stressed because there is a lot of unpredictability. And I think if they are honest enough, and I think with the leadership honest enough, they will agree that that is going to be an inevitable consequence of restructures and mergers, because there is a lot that we just don't know yet. And so the levels of stress are very high because of the levels of unpredictability. Interesting enough, studies show that if we have predictability, we can cope with stress a lot better. The next one relates to outlets. Well, in social hierarchies, let's face it, be the boss. Just be the boss. And then you can offload all your frustration or your stress on subordinates, because inevitably that's what happens in social hierarchies. Whether you're a leader and you admit it or not, hey, let's just face it. When you're a leader, you have that opportunity to offload and displace your stress on others. And I know that happens all the time because I was in a middle management leadership role. And trust me, I felt the stress being offloaded on me on a daily basis, and it wasn't fun. And of course, in turn, I too then offload that stress to subordinates below me, and it just goes down the chain. So if you can, be the boss, because your stress levels will drop considerably. Definitely be the boss. Now, if you can't be the boss, and let's face it, not everyone wants to be the boss, nor does everyone want to aspire to be the boss. But if you can't be the boss, then get friends who will listen to you, because it's that social support. They can provide you with having the right type of friends at the right time. Think of Turbo and Sludge and even Axel the animal at the pub. They're there every day having beers. Yeah, they're having beers. But I'll tell you what, it's the social support that's happening at the pub that matters. They're going off, they're blowing off steam. And that's what that's all about. It's the social support that's happening. Can you get it from other places other than the pub? Of course you can. I'm certainly not advocating drinking here, and I'm definitely not doing that. What I'm advocating for is social support. And of course, there are other avenues in which you can get social support. And I know from my own experiences, I got fantastic social support when I was playing footy and cricket and all sorts of different sports. And it doesn't have to be sporting communities too, by the way. I realise that, but I'm just giving you that example from my own life. Now, an important qualifying point. Just because you may be able to do one or more of these things, then there is just no guarantee that you won't suffer from stress. It's just, unfortunately, stress is just one of those inevitable things about life, right? However, these things may alleviate the severity of these symptoms. That's what they will do. So they will turn them from acute to episodic, or episodic to acute. And we want to move from chronic stress down the chain. We want to move it to acute stress, something that will pass. Now, just like certain stress management approaches that can function as a protective mechanism in combating and coping with stress. Some perfect examples I just want to mention now. Now, I think it's important that I point out the protective way physical activity works. Now, we already know, science tells us this, that physical activity is a known protective mechanism for countering stress. And it counters stress generally through two ways. So the first one is that it decreases your risk of various metabolic and cardiovascular diseases, and therefore decreases the negative impact stress may worsen these diseases. And two, exercise generally makes you feel better. That's the endorphins. That's those chemicals released in your body that just make you feel fantastic. And there is some scientific evidence that makes it very clear that exercise makes for a smaller stress response to various psychological stresses. In fact, there's something about running and doing something repetitive with exercise that helps with this. I'm just kind of thinking of my own personal experiences of running on the treadmill or running or hiking. There is something about how it combats stress. Now, it's important to note that the benefit of exercise is kind of relatively short term. What I mean by short term, well, generally we're talking about a few hours, maybe a day or so. So yes, exercise is great for reducing stress if that's what you want to do, okay? But forcing someone to exercise actually can make things worse for you. There's some actually really interesting studies with mice actually about this, where they compared a mice who didn't want to exercise and actually forced them to run on the treadmill, the spinning wheel. Actually, the health of that mice actually got worse because they were forced to run on the treadmill when they didn't want to, compared to another mice where they actually wanted to run and they were motivated to run on the treadmill and they actually had positive health outcomes. Now, there's something fascinating about that study, but I think there's something interesting here that you can take away from that. Now, if you want to do physical activity, generally they recommend aerobic exercise is generally better for your health than, say, anaerobic exercise. And so what is that? Well, when you think kind of anaerobic exercise, I just want you to think that you get your heart rate up, and generally you want your heart rate up enough where you can't hold a conversation with another person. So that's the general rule of thumb when it comes to aerobic exercise. You want it to get your heart rate up enough where you can't have a conversation with someone. Anaerobic, just think they're just short bursts. That's just like running 100 meters and then stopping or going up a flight of stairs. You can still do anaerobic exercise, but generally they're saying that aerobic exercise is better for you in terms of combating stress. And it's important also to do sustained physical activity or exercise over a period of time. And now, I know people have done whole PhDs on exercise prescription here, but let's just keep this simple, right? Basically, you want to do it at about 3 or more days per week. So think of maybe Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday or Sunday. And you want to do it a minimum 20, 30 minutes at a time. Of course, anything more than that is great. But if you're just starting out, maybe 5, 10 minutes might be enough. And then the following week, you might go to 20 minutes and so on and so forth. The other thing to note here is probably best not to overdo it. So if you have an exercise for a long period of time, don't go smash yourself in the gym for an hour. You might want to ease into it, okay? That's how injuries happen too, by the way, I should point out as well. Now, many people use physical activity to cope with stress. And by the way, it doesn't have to be exercise at the gym. It could just be simply going for a walk. And so I would just recommend physical activity as an option to consider. And the science is pretty clear here. It is a very protective mechanism against stress. Now, for me, I find regular physical activity crucial for managing stress. And I know the same applies to producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie. And I know from just talking to colleagues that physical activity is just really important for just maintaining general health and well-being. Another one here, and I've mentioned it before in other episodes, is meditation. Now, the interesting thing about meditation is when it's done on a regular basis, say a minimum of 15 minutes per day, meditation is actually good for your health, particularly lowering your stress levels. Indeed, studies have shown the health benefits of meditation, but it's less clear how long the good effects last. It's a bit like exercise. It's generally short-term we're talking hours, maybe days. As for meditation, the research literature is a little bit inconclusive here. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't engage with meditation here. Now, finally, there are lots of different types of meditation, and this is where it kind of gets a little bit grey here. And it's quite difficult to determine which approach is better, say, than another approach. But the main thing to note here is that just be really careful when someone says to you that their approach is, say, better than another approach. And so for me, meditation, without a doubt, and I've said this in earlier episodes, it has been a game changer for me. For my health and well-being, a game changer. And I don't mind telling people. I'll kind of shout it from the mountaintops if I have to. So I'm a huge advocate of meditation. And I'm no tree-hugging hippie from Byron Bay. Sorry to people from Byron Bay. I do happen to like Byron Bay, but I'm no tree-hugging hippie here, trust me. And I've found meditation has been a game changer for me. Now, I realise it's not for everyone because it's really challenging for a whole range of reasons. I realise it's probably not going to work for Turbo and Sludge. They're probably not going to give it a go, but it's really challenging. It's really challenging to be in your own thoughts for a consistent period of time. Some people just can't handle it. Some people can't deal with their internal dialogue, their internal voices. They can't be still longer than 5 minutes. This is the challenge. And I'm not trying to say it's easy. It's really challenging. Now, it can also be really confusing about what approach to adopt. And I'm the first person to admit that. And so this is where experimentation comes into play. And then maybe sticking with an approach for a period of time to see if it works. And then if it works, stick to it. And then try and schedule it in your day so it becomes a healthy habit. So for me, bloody hard to do 5 minutes. For months, really tough. I found it really challenging to do 5 minutes. And once I could kind of get to that 5 minute mark and I found something that worked for me, I stick to it like glue. I'm still doing it today, the same approach. And I build it up each day from 5 minutes to 6 minutes to 7 minutes and so on and so forth, to the point where I'm now up to 15 minutes. And I've been consistently at 15 minutes for a couple of months now. And it's taken me years just to get to that point. This is how I know it can be really, really challenging and not necessarily for everyone. However, it is worth persisting with. Now, let's get to another stress management strategy. This one's a little bit controversial now because I'm going to now religion and spirituality. Now, the idea that religion or spirituality protects against disease, for instance, it's healthy for you, particularly stress-related disease, it's controversial, and I'm the first person to admit that. Now, it's controversial for a few reasons, and let me explain why. Now, the main controversy stems from the claims being made about the relationship between religion and good health. Now, religion may make you healthy because religion is often associated with a religious community. That's that social support that we talked about earlier. It also has quite meaningful social roles, has good role models, and there are a whole range of other things that potentially could contribute to good health. But the effect size may be so small and inconsequential that it's probably not even worth mentioning. So that's an important point there. Now, another controversial point has to do with the type of deity or deities you believe in. For example, for many who believe, to a certain extent, there is comfort in just knowing that when things go right or wrong, that there's just an explanation for it. For instance, there's a kind of purpose for the existential void in their lives. Or there might be an explanation for why something has gone well for them or why something has gone poorly for them, or right or wrong, for instance. Now, it's important to be balanced here. And so I think it's really important I mention how religion can actually make an individual's health and psychological well-being worse. Particularly religion and religious practice, or even just sometimes religious people, that can actually significantly traumatize people. And they have. There are many, many historical examples to prove my point here. And I don't want to get bogged down about some of these examples here because all you have to do is do a quick search to see why. But some of the practices, some of the historical practices of certain religions have been less than desirable and quite rightly should be criticised. As for me, I was raised in a religious family, and so I can definitely see the pros and cons of religion, without a doubt. But in this case, I'm actually really skeptical about the claims that are being made here in relation to stress. On a separate point, and maybe a relevant point, sometimes spirituality is a more attractive option from the two options. And in the same way, I also realise and respect the fact that for many people, neither religion and spirituality are an option. And there are other ways to find meaning and purpose in life through secular pursuits, like communion with nature. What religion and spirituality have to do with alleviating stress still has me baffled a little bit, but I am mentioning it because it is part of the research literature that I have looked at in preparation for this episode. Anyway, let's move on to my next point. All right, my next point relates to picking the right strategy at the right time when dealing with stress. Now, there is a concept that's called cognitive flexibility, and the cognitive flexibility basically, if something bad is happening and our attempts to cope with it are not working, then one of our most common responses, and this is quite common, and I see this all the time, is to double down and work twice as hard. Now, in light of this, cognitive flexibility during these times of stress is about finding the resources to try something new. This is why cognitive flexibility is so difficult and challenging when it comes to stress management, because when you're in the middle of a stressful event, and let's face it, when it is a stressful event, it's actually really difficult to see potential options beyond your default setting, which is inevitably to double down and just work harder. Now, this is where social support can actually be quite useful, because generally your spouse or your partner or your family or friends are sometimes in a better position to see what the right strategy is. And automatically I think of producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie, who has many times who saved my bacon and said, oh, hang on, Stephen, I'm not sure you realise something here, but things are actually not as bad as actually you think they are, because have you ever considered solution A, B, C, and D? And he's right, quite rightly, because you're so in the moment dealing with the stress that you miss things. And that's the benefit of social support. That's the benefit for someone who's close to you, knows your circumstances, maybe knows the stressful event, can actually be objective enough to say, hang on, it's actually probably not as bad as you first think here, because if you consider option A, B, C, and D, that's a potential solution or a way forward. Now, of course, what matters here is that you are open enough to consider the options. Kudos to me, right? Yeah, because I've taken advice, listened to producer Luke, and I've considered the options. But for a lot of people, they are closed-minded, and that's an important point. It's about being open-minded to alternatives. In a sense, some of these stress management approaches are about being open-minded to dealing and coping with stress. Next one I want to just go to before I nearly finish this episode here and just recap some of the main points is the 80-20 rule in relation to stress management. Now, when it comes to managing stress, it's not really going to happen until you've actually decided to make a change in your life. And I mean really decided you want to make some changes in your life. So that could be as simple as, oh, I actually need to exercise. Not only because it's good for me, but it also helps me cope with stress. If anything, this represents the 20% effort because it's relevant to stress management. And think of it like this. It doesn't really matter what stress management technique you actually adopt, because it's about just doing something that you know that works for you. It's a bit like I said before about meditation. I had no idea it was going to work for me, but it's starting to work, and so I'm just going to keep doing it. And what that means here simply is experiment. Try something that works, and then if it means doing something or experimenting with different approaches or working out what works for you, then it doesn't really matter as long as it works for you. So when you find something that works for you, then take time out of your day, schedule it, make it a habit. And if you manage to do that, then you're well on your way to the 80%. So at the end of the day, it's just about giving it a go. That's the open-mindedness that I was talking about before. It was about, a bit like I mentioned earlier before about the meditation. just giving it a go. I had no idea if it was going to work for months on end. I found it difficult. I didn't get any benefit at all, but I stuck with it. And it's a bit like exercise. I just stuck with it. It's now a habit. In fact, when I miss days of exercise, I feel terrible. And that just shows you the important impact physical activity can have on your life. Same with meditation. If I miss a meditation session, then I notice it in other ways. Now, I want to finish with Gabor Maté's 7 A's of Healing, found in his book titled When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress. And the details will be in the episode descriptor. Now, I want to mention this book because it has some really, really, really thought-provoking things to say about dealing with stress. So let's have a look at what these 7 A's are. The first A is acceptance. Now, acceptance is simply accepting the willingness to recognize and accept how things are. That could be a challenge. The second one is awareness, and awareness relates to paying attention to the signs of stress in our bodies and learning to trust our instincts as messages to be heeded. For instance, you might have a tight neck and your shoulders might be coming around and you might find it difficult to relax at night. And it's about understanding and identifying that your body, like the body keeps the score from Professor Van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's like understanding that our body stores the stress. And it's about being in tune with our bodies and understanding how our bodies are sending us messages to respond and say, hey, hang on, I need to do something about this stress. And yes, I can do something about this stress, particularly if it's acute, episodic, and chronic. The next one, which I found really interesting, is anger. Now, anger does not require hostile acting out, because inevitably when everyone thinks anger, they think people losing control, losing their shit. First and foremost, it is a physiological process of discharging energy. And secondly, it actually does have value because anger does not exist in a vacuum. And so it can actually provide essential information about a person's perceptions of a situation. Sometimes when someone is angry, there are legitimate reasons why. And they don't have ways of discharging it. And this is the key point. Depending on how we deal with the anger, say by choosing a healthy or unhealthy outlet, will basically have consequences for our health. For example, healthy anger just leaves the body, whereas unhealthy anger just turns inward and it just remains in the body, causing all sorts of problems. And that's the point what I found interesting in Professor Van der Kolk's book about the body keeps the score. If you turn that anger inwards on yourself, it has significant negative implications for your health and well-being. It just stays in your body. And that's why I think the title of that book is so relevant. The body keeps the score. Our body has a memory. It just keeps and stores the stress. In this case here, it stores the anger. And you know what? If we don't discharge of it healthily, in a healthy way, then yes, it can be problematic. For instance, healthy ways of discharging anger is through exercise. That would be considered to be a healthy way. And one of the things I remember doing when I was a secondary school teacher, and I used to teach a lot of boys and footy groups and cricket groups, all the boys groups, is that I would introduce boxing and use boxing a lot, dealing with young people's anger, particularly young male boys' anger, who do tend to carry a lot of anger. And I found that I had unbelievably positive results dealing with boys and boxing and exercise, even healthy outlets like playing footy and cricket and sport. And I'm a huge advocate of sport beyond the health and well-being benefits. Now, back to my next point. We're on to number 4 now, which is autonomy. Now, autonomy is the development of an internal center of control, where control starts from the inside, not from the outside in. It's a bit like I said before. The research is very clear here. A strong internal locus of control, that's that agency where I feel like I'm in control, is crucial. You can take back your life. You can deal with your own stress. Don't be a victim and feel like I can't deal with the stress. You can. This is the really important stuff. You need to take back your life. I want to advocate for that agency. I want to just say to you, you can take back your life, and you can, if you are suffering from stress, become healthy again. Next one is attachment. Now, attachment is our connection with the world. Study after study makes it quite clear that people who are lonely due to a lack of social contact significantly increase their risks of negative health and wellbeing outcomes. Now, I've done an early episode on this, and if you're interested, just listen to my podcast on loneliness if you want to learn more about these negative outcomes and what you can actually do about it. Conversely, people who actually enjoy genuine social support face a better prognosis, and no matter what the condition is. In a sense, our capacity for attachment and the conscious need for contact is necessary for healing. The next one, number 6, is assertion. Now, assertion is the opposite of action and has to do with letting go of the very need to act. Now, some of this is philosophical and connects with a branch of philosophy called existentialism, but it's really apt and relevant here. It actually has practical application. Let me explain. Now, often out of fear, we get trapped in the illusion we must act or react, when in fact, all that is needed is being, which in this case is the absence of acting or reacting. And that's what meditation does. Meditation is about being. It's about the absence of acting and reacting. The 7th one is affirmation. When we affirm, we move towards something of value. And there are 2 values that can assist in healing and helping us to remain whole. And the first one, or the first value, is our own creative self and the urge to honor creativity and to create. And that can be expressed in a whole range of different ways. It could be writing, it could be art, it could be music, and there could be other creative pursuits. For me, this podcast, yes, is a creative urge of sorts. And it's a perfect example of that, at least an example I think of automatically anyway. And the second great affirmation is of the universe itself and our connection with it that generates a general sense of wonder in terms of discovering for ourselves what our meaning and purpose in life is. As difficult as this may sound, the human condition seeks out meaning and purpose. And when there isn't one, nihilism quickly follows. And when we think of nihilism, I just want you to think of helplessness. I want you to think of standing at the edge of abyss, looking into a black hole. That's nihilism. And maybe in a future episode, I might do an episode on nihilism. Now, the implications of the 7 A's for healing as it relates to stress and coping with stress should not be discounted and dismissed as some kind of new age nonsense, because there is much that overlaps with other areas of scientific research on managing stress. This is the crazy thing about the 7 A's, is some of this might sound a little bit philosophical and existential as we get towards the latter part of the 7 A's. It's eerily similar to what the scientific research has to say about managing stress, and it shouldn't be dismissed as new age nonsense. Now, let's recap some of the main points. I want to leave you with a few takeaway points. Now, acute and episodic acute stress is normal and something we all experience from time to time. And this is why we are mostly familiar with these types of stress. But in this episode, I've been mainly interested in chronic stress, particularly the negative impacts it has on your health and well-being. Now, with chronic stress, just remember, this is where homeostasis really gets reestablished and over time can contribute to a range of adverse effects on our health and well-being. And there are a whole range of different situations that actually can bring on chronic stress, such as poverty, a dysfunctional family, being trapped in an unhappy marriage, and so on and so forth. It's a relatively long list. Now, stress is heavily rooted in psychology because when you are no longer dealing with a predator chasing you And when you have sufficient shelter and food to sustain good health, and once all these needs have been met, then what is left is how we perceive and interpret events. Now, up to a point, this approach may help deal with mild stressor, but there are a range of limitations. For example, the idea that an approach would work for, say, a homeless person or a terminal cancer patient is just ridiculous, okay? So I'm the first person to acknowledge that. Inevitably, this leads to the question of how we can cope with stress. Now, probably an important starting point worth noting relates to variability. And given the same stresses, many humans vary tremendously in how our bodies and psyches cope. For example, consider the studies of people carrying out dangerous and stressful jobs. And like I've mentioned earlier, these studies show the same pattern. Most people have massive stress responses, and there are a subset that are unflustered. Now, the good news is that we can change the way we cope both physically and psychologically. Just like Axel the animal became unflustered with parachuting on the weekends for fun through conditioning and adaptation, the good news is that we can also become unflustered by parachuting over time, if we wanted to. Stress management strategies that are worth considering, like physical activity, meditation, getting more control and predictability in your life, more outlets, social support, religion and spirituality, they are worth considering. And I actually would like you to consider those. But at the end of the day, it's about picking the right strategy at the right time. And if all fails, go with the 80-20 rule of stress management. The first 20% isn't going to happen until you've decided you want to change. And I mean really decided. And in a sense, represents the 20%. And from there, it doesn't really matter what stress management approaches you adopt, because at the end of the day, it's just about doing something that works for you. This means experimenting with what works for you. But when you discover it, then do it daily, because you will be on your way to the other 80%. There are just no secrets here. It's about doing something, anything, and just doing it over time. As a viable alternative, I then considered the 7 A's of healing, and they are worth seriously considering in terms of healing and remaining whole. And I think I might leave it there. As we close today's exploration of stress, I'm reminded that we aren't simply experiencing stress, we're actively interpreting it, we're metabolizing it, and we're being transformed by it in every passing moment. It's in our body. It stays in our body. The same physiological response that can erode our health can also, with subtle shifts, become the foundation of our greatest resilience. Perhaps the most profound paradox is this: stress reveals both our vulnerability and our remarkable capacity for adaptation. It exposes our limits while simultaneously inviting us to transcend them. The question isn't whether we can eliminate stress from our lives, because I think that's impossible, to be honest. The deeper question is whether we can develop a more nuanced relationship with our stress responses, one that actually honours their evolutionary wisdom while not surrendering to their sometimes outdated commands. As you move back in your day after this episode, I invite you to notice not just when you feel stressed, but how you're relating to that stress. Are you fighting it? Feeding it? Finding ways to flow with it? Until next time, this is Dr. Stephen Stolz reminding you that our deepest thinking often happens not when we're perfectly calm, but when we're skillfully navigating the turbulence. This has been Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz. Thanks for listening. Until next time, stay curious and think deeply. A huge thank you to my amazing producer Luke Watson, aka producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie. Your endless support, creativity, and hard work made this podcast possible, and I'm so grateful to have you by my side on this journey. I couldn't do it without you, and here's to many more episodes together. Thanks, mate.